really, really wonderful to be here with all of you and with my friend Jon.
I second that emotion.
Yes. And this conversation on race, justice, and mindfulness is one that's near and dear to my heart, I know. I know it's obviously near and dear to Jon's, and I suspect that you're here because it's close to your hearts as well. Yes. So I want to kind of acknowledge that we all are entering into this conversation together. And I want to really thank you for taking the time, the energy to focus on this. What we'd like to do before we get into conversation is really invite a moment of embodied practice. Right? So we just had an opportunity to check in with each other, which is great, see where everybody was geographically. If we could also just take a moment to drop in, settle in, sensing into where we are here in my beloved city of San Francisco, our beloved city for many of us. Sensing into the body in this room, whether eyes closed or eyes open, just really feel your way into the deep sense of your belonging in this time, in this particular place. And from this place of a bit more grounding, feeling the feet on the floor and the connection to the earth beneath that, sensing into all of the millennia of human developmental wisdom that your own embodiment carries. See if you can sense into the way your ancestors' wisdom, the struggles that they survive, are a part of what you bring into your ways of knowing about this topic. We all have information about this topic. So as we come out of this space of just sort of reflecting on who we are, the cultures we represent, the experiences that are kind of coming into this conversation through our particular embodiments, I want to see if you can, when you're ready, if you've had your eyes closed, feel free, please, to open them when you're ready. And take a moment or two to sort of look around, if you will. We are privileged to see your beautiful faces, but if we could just take a moment or two and really take in the people around you. I know you've done, again, some geographic check-ins, but let's take in the faces of the people who are here, who are joining us in this conversation. And sense into who might not be here, what communities might not be as represented as we might love to see. Yeah? So, thank you. Because I believe that this conversation about race, justice, and mindfulness, addressing society's pain, inequality, and disenfranchisement, right, requires that we do just what we just did, focus on our own personal practice commitments and what they mean for the world. So I'll enter into this conversation by sharing, again, I teach at the University of San Francisco. I teach law. I teach with a very diverse group of students. And I bring mindfulness into the work of helping students understand our historical intersections between race and law, much of which has been about a story of injustice, actually. If you go all the way back to our founding and up through till today, literally through till today, we are once again met with these questions about what it means to be a democratic political community with at least the promise of working for everybody, with at least a real, genuine promise of working for everybody. We know that when we were founded, we really weren't committed to this being for everybody, right? Can we just acknowledge that? We founded, we right away decided that this was not going to be for everybody. We, literally 3 years after the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, we enacted the first Immigration Act of 1790. And in that very first act, we made whiteness a prerequisite for one's being able to become a naturalized citizen. And whiteness was a prerequisite for being able to naturalize, just as one example of what we've done to construct a kind of political community. We've had a racial test for that since 1952. It wasn't until 52 that we literally backed away from race, whiteness in particular, being privileged and who could become a citizen. So that's just one example. I want to touch into that just to kind of help us reconnect with the way that we have our personal commitments to trying to make the world a better place, the kind of world we would all like to live in. And we want to ask ourselves, who's in that we when we think about creating a world that works for all of us? Is it everybody? Is it everybody? Is it everybody? Right? Personal work to do that, interpersonal work, and also systems. Right? I wouldn't be here personally if there hadn't been systemic efforts, actually. I was born in North Carolina in segregated community there with very low expectations that had been transmitted through the generations for people that look like me. So for me, this work of bringing mindfulness into the world is really work that comes through us in all our sort of beautiful and glorious and divine and different particulars. I feel like our own personal stories and how we enter into this is a beautiful gift. It's not always an easy gift, but each of us has a story, and each of us have ways of kind of working with this thing, for example, called race. We have experiences of it, and we have ways that we may be experimenting with using mindfulness and compassion practices to support us. We're going to need that in the days ahead. So I will just say that for me, bringing a kind self-compassion has been a really important part of my capacity to enter into conversations again and again and again about these issues that many people don't want to talk about. Frankly, whites in particular often feel really uncomfortable and have all kinds of discomforting emotions come up when it comes to talking about this, but all of us in some way or another, we've been hurt and we've suffered. And therefore, having these practices, at least as a ground of support, has been really, really important. I'll say that research is a growing body of research is confirming the importance of this work of mindfulness as a support for doing the work of making our institutions and our societies as inclusive as possible. It's showing that mindfulness has been shown to reduce bias, loving kindness practice to reduce bias, both of those to help deal with those difficult emotions that I just alluded to, often coming into the room when we talk about these. So there's, again, a body of research that I've been kind of really gathering and focusing in on, and I think we all might do well to look at that. But the research confirms that we need to deepen our connections. Segregation and resegregation is a real problem. Of the rise of white nationalism without it being engaged is a real problem, and many of us are feeling much more vulnerable. So, as a Black woman with a deep commitment to mindfulness, and I use the phrase this is Black and woman not lightly, and not even in a way that is fixed. Could I just say, for me, I use these labels in a way to signify that I am open to a conversation about how our particular embodiments impact us in the world. It's not to say that I think that the label Black woman captures all that I am. I don't. I know it doesn't. But it's about a political decision to say, I'm open for this conversation. Are we open for the conversations that have to do with how we are packaged, in a way, thrown into a world with a gender designation, cisgendered a certain way, we made trans into something, but thrown in with something that other people will call race, even if we don't, with class experience, even if we're not paying attention to it, that impacts us, not just personal or interpersonally, but systemically sort of sets us up for being in a particular standpoint for addressing and working with these issues. So given that we all have a standpoint, and it can make it harder or less hard for us to enter into this conversation, I wanted to turn to Jon and really hear a bit, given the tremendous work you've done to really make mindfulness accessible, to make mindfulness-based stress reduction in particular, but mindfulness with a big M, accessible for so many people. I see your work as a model for how we might universally expand our capacity to deal with difference, to deal with the challenge of dislocation that we've been hearing talked about. Those dislocations are not going to fall evenly on all of us. They've already started to hit some communities in very, very treacherous ways. So how do you see mindfulness, and how has it even first shown up in your own life as a support for dealing with these issues?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that I'm happy to be here with all of you and happy to be on the stage with you, Rhonda. And to just say that we're all in this together in some sense, and there is a certain element of preaching to the choir because the people we may really want to reach couldn't afford to come to this conference in the first place, even if they live right in this city. So there are a lot of kind of contradictions that are in some sense at the heart of our enterprise here. And it's both unbelievably urgent and at the same time really important not to get caught up in a certain kind of frenetic, fear-driven energy that actually just sort of compounds our confusion and our lack of clarity. So we are basically where we are, as usual, and with things as they have brought us to this point, including, 400 unacknowledged years of the sort of genocide of the native populations in this country, the enslavement of people who were brought over here for the enrichment. I mean, it's like totally economic thing for the enrichment of other people, and a certain way in which to come drill down to the mindfulness in the short time that we have and why that might be of value. What is mindfulness? Well, it's basically about waking up. And the hardest things to wake up to are the things that we ignore or don't pay attention to or are, in some sense, inured to because of things like implicit bias or white privilege, so that you only see with the lenses that have actually been conditioned by our own upbringing. And of course, as you all know, even in such a kind of homogeneous audience, every single person in this room is the absolute center of the known by us universe. Okay? So we tend to be very self-centric. The problem is that everybody else is also the center of the known universe, and so we have to, in some sense, negotiate, how come you're the center of the universe when it's clearly me? And so the potential for mindfulness, both at an individual, say, meditative practice, cultivating the muscle, fine-tuning the instrument, and also at work, in family life, in the world, in our interface with every aspect of being, we navigate, we make choices on the basis of our implicit mental models, which often further blindness, so that, people can run around for decades being, sort of aficionados of mindfulness, and at the same time, like same old blindness, same old. We are at high risk for that, and I think it's really important in terms of the community that we help each other wake up, and that we're willing to get into serious discomfort zones around this kind of thing, because it's so easy to just play your own tune of, like, I'm the center of the universe and I'm such a good person and I'm doing it all right, none of which is wrong, but it's not a big enough story. And to kind of link it to MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, the whole idea of MBSR was to, in some sense, try to bring the deep dimensionality of wisdom, 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, based on sort of a universal dharma that was most elaborately articulated by the Buddha a very long time ago, but not limited to Buddhism by any stretch of the imagination. It's really a human evolutionary flowering. To see if that might not actually resonate in the heart of people who are suffering at the level of the body, the heart, and the mind in particular, or social conditions. And, um, and one of the things that was a lesson learned for me is that it really was not offered in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or Wisconsin, or Berkeley, but it was offered in Worcester, Massachusetts, which was like kind of in the 50s when everybody else was in the late 70s and 80s, and very much a working class white community, very much like the people who voted, in this election for, Trump. So, and there was no question that mindfulness spoke to them in a way that was liberating, that was profound, that was expansive, that was larger. And so from the very beginning, MBSR was always meant to, in some sense, be a fulcrum to leverage something much larger than my own personal health and well-being, a public health intervention, so to speak, to move the bell curve of society, not merely towards physical well-being, but to emotional and societal well-being at the level where we start to recognize what separates us and what separates me from myself, of which there is an enormous amount of pain, even if you have tons of money and you sort of outwardly look like very successful and healthy and happy. The befriending of one's own true nature is the DNA of well-being and happiness at the level of the individual and then the level of the body politic. So in a sense, I keep coming back to this biological sort of sense that if we think about the body politic, all of the cells of the body need a blood supply. Would you agree? Like, we can't say, well, those pancreas cells, like, we'll give them like a third of the blood supply. And the brain, like, it's so cool, we'll give it like a lot more. Of course, the brain already has a lot more for certain reasons. But we need a minimal distribution for everybody, okay? Well, you've heard on the platform just today. I mean, income distribution is being stretched to the point where the actual cells of the body politic, which are all of us, are being starved, so to speak, for the kind of core elemental nutrient of being part of a healthy society. And we need, in an infinite number of ways, to recognize that nobody wins in that kind of situation. Because if you have the heart and the lungs going to war with each other over who's better, that is not so great for the body. And if we start thinking about the body politic, either as the country at the moment, which we better start thinking about, or also globally, the body of the earth, then each one of us is in some sense a cell. And I'm not just talking about the people in this room, I'm talking about the people on this planet. And that there's a certain way in which I feel like what mindfulness can do in its broadest articulation is help us all wake up and recognize the interconnectedness of all of us and then restructure society. As you've heard on this platform, there's a lot of pain associated with it. But when we bring awareness and when we bring wisdom to this, then I have every confidence that the human species as a whole could thread that needle in such a way that we can transform the world in the direction of maximizing well-being and minimizing harm. But it can't be more for me or my well-being. It has to be, in some sense, selfless, which is actually the heart of this practice in the first place, is inquiring, well, who am I? Am I a woman? Am I a black woman? And as soon as you start to get into descriptors, there's a certain way in which, even though they are, natural to utilize, if you are too attached to them, a certain kind of pain arises, a certain kind of ignorance. And so we need to find non-dual ways to actually heal our country, our lives, and that social justice is not some kind of second-order phenomenon that we need to if you have extra energy, let's do social justice. No, it's absolutely at the heart of wisdom. It's at the heart of compassion. It's at recognizing self in others, so to speak, and then living as if that was our top priority. And I've seen this happen in so many different domains of life that I have a lot of hope, and that's why I keep coming back to Wisdom 2.0, that this will generate the kind of vibrational energies that when we move out of San Francisco and back into our own, that we are actually the vectors of the transformation we want to see. And that individual practice and the grounding in stillness and being and non-doing is not a waste of time. It's like an oxygen line straight into the heart, but also into the heart of wisdom. And therefore, it depends on all of us to, in some sense, find the conversations that we need to have with whoever we need to have them, to stretch the envelope and to be really aware when we start to recoil and feel like the other there and we don't want to deal with their pain and we look away. It's a form of violence that I don't see any other. And ultimately, of course, we can restructure laws and so forth, but we have enough trouble just, electing a president. So restructuring laws is a long way off, but there's a certain lawfulness in how we are together with each other that I think is liberating and not merely for oneself.
Yeah, absolutely. So how do we move from that sense of the lawfulness of that arises for each of us, I'm sure, in our practice communities, our sanghas, in wisdom, right, in this group, right? We have this felt sense of the lawfulness, the sort of inherent, implicit justness of this kind of interconnectedness where we understand that my well-being is infinitely connected with yours. How do we move from kind of being with that, knowing that, to supporting deep engagement with the suffering that we know is in our midst? For me, I do work, as I said, with lawyers and law students, so I bring mindfulness right into my law school classrooms, and we talk about constitutional law, equality law, these immigration orders. I have students here in San Francisco from all across the world. So we have Middle Eastern hijab-wearing law students who are sitting with African-American students, Latino students. It's a very diverse mix of folk. And what we do is we try to work on bringing mindfulness to bear right at the heart of people feeling the pain of this period where suddenly Muslims are being singled out as one example, who feel more vulnerable now. My students are finding ways to use mindfulness to encounter each other so that they can speak to those differences in experience, right? We can speak to the differences in experience, but at the same time, you see that as a window into this sense of oneness or interconnectedness. Right, so they're learning, actually, that there's a way that by actually speaking about, who we are, using those terms that, again, are not meant to capture who we are forever, to say that I'm a black woman, but to say the struggle of women for liberation is mine too. And it intersects with the struggle of people all around the world, and even in this room, right, who are seeking liberation but have been denied it because of what they look like. It's to say, I'm in that, and I'm also deeply through that, feeling the life force that connects us all, the life force that helps us all see that we all want justice, and that we know that, again, whatever justice looks like for me, it has to include you. It has to include all of us. I think it's actually not as easy as talking about it, as I'm sure you all know. We've learned, if we've learned nothing else over the last year, I think, we've learned that perhaps we were not as far along in dealing with these issues as we thought we were, right? I've been teaching race at USF and classes like this for 17, 18 years. For many, many years, I had people tell me, aren't we over that? Do we really still need to be teaching those classes? Honestly. And at least now people are saying, oh, yes, I guess we do need those classes. But it's sort of been a reckoning and a reawakening, as Jon said. It's an awakening to what actually has just been there. And in a certain sense, I think what we're dealing with is the fact that much of what we feel pained about, the way in which we cut each other off, we disrespect each other, we don't see each other because people don't have the resume that we think they should have, or they don't come from the same kind of religious or other kind of community. those, or the ways that gender still
This
shows
is a
up.
kind of othering.
It's othering, yeah.
I was thinking about like sort of the classical Buddhist framework for, sort of greed, hatred, and delusion, or greed, aversion and delusion. I think othering needs to be brought into the conversation. It's usually on the aversion side, but it's like the separation of you from me, and it's a visceral, very often, feeling of like, encountering poverty on the street or homelessness or whatever it is. And there's a certain way in which we can make use of that to actually open to a wisdom dimension that is not about fixing society or doing one particular script when you encounter homelessness or injustice, but to actually inquire as to who you are in the face of this, and whether that's kind of like out there and not relevant to your own developmental arc. I would assert that it is absolutely critical to our individual developmental arcs, but that we're all in some sense each other's teachers, and no one's gone very far in this practice, but the potential for it, combined with technology, but also remembering that we are still analog beings, and we're going to be analog beings, hopefully, for a little while longer. And before we give ourselves over to the digital analog interface, to get memory upgrades if you're over 50 years old or something like that, it might be good to really recognize fully what it means to be an embodied human being. And I think that that's what is being called for. And I have to say that I just really admire you and so many of your colleagues who are at the sort of front cutting edge of redefining what it means to study the law or to actually give birth to laws, because it's, in some sense, to go back to the biological analogy, like there's a certain lawfulness of the body. Again, if the heart and the lungs go to war or the whatever, you've got disease. So there's a certain way in which there's a lawfulness built into our homeostatic dynamical processes in health, all the way down to the gene expression level. And when it works well, hey, it works really well. And when it doesn't work well, you get all sorts of diseases that we have beautiful hospitals that try to work with. But the power of this is that we now need to bring this to the heart of the social contract, in some sense, or the planetary contract, because we know enough now that's really true, if you still have any credence in truth of one kind or another, or evidence rapidly disappearing, that actually tilts things in the direction of wisdom. And I want to just acknowledge Soren's genius in naming the conference this way, because we need to all ask ourselves what wisdom really is, not just assume we know, or those people have it and I want it, but that to deeply inquire what it would mean in the face of all of the suffering, all of the disregard, all of the pain, all of the history. What is my individual responsibility, and how can we, in some sense, collectively frame, whether it's developing new laws or sort of looking at the economy in fresh ways so that none of the cells get so squeezed for blood supply that they are starved. So economic injustice and inequality, social injustice and inequality. This is the fabric of mindfulness practice.
Yes. And
or heartfulness practice would be
yes.
another way to put it.
And may we do this with love. I mean, that's the hard part. We are so wounded. And really, we are wounded. And we're about to be wounded more. We heard those panelists. Like, all these dislocations are happening. How many of you felt a little bit of anxiety just listening? All the changes that are already happening. They are already happening. Chicago, in certain neighborhoods, African-American neighborhoods, already 50% unemployment. So we talk about what's going to happen with loss of jobs in the future for other people. It's happening. Yeah. So can we meet this suffering that is already happening on a large scale for many of us around the world? Can we meet it with love and kindness that includes us all? And can we really look at these projects of mindfulness as not just personal and interpersonal, but systemic and structural in some way? Because I think that world that we hope to create needs us. Really needs absolutely all of us to be committed not just to sitting on our own, but actually engaging in the planet that needs our help and our love, that's been giving us so much love all this time, but engaging with what's happening, the suffering that's actually happening from this place of deep, interconnected, ethical wholeness and well-being.
So this is not going to end here. We're going to be on stage in a half an hour continuing this. Plus, the next group of folks that are going to be on the stage are really going to come at this through a kind of different angle, through the same crystal, so to speak. And I feel like if whatever it was that brought you to sit in this room for this period of time and listen to a very brief encapsulation of something that we could spend hours with, trust that. It's trustworthy. And the more you nurture it in whatever ways you can, and the more you're willing to stretch your own envelope, the more we will all, in some sense, benefit and grow out of the kind of fear and delusion that is such a fuel for violence and disregard and harm in our society. So, Rhonda, thank you for the opportunity. And for all the great work that you're doing. And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all.